I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, teacher and podcaster, and you're about to start healing from your eating disorder and transforming your life and your relationship with food and body. I've worked in NHS and private practice supporting clients for 20 years, and I believe that recovery is possible for you. This podcast dives into expert interviews, evidence-based psychological approaches, and anecdotal tips from the therapy room from my years of experience. If you're wanting to heal your relationship with food, feel confident in your body, develop self-love and self-acceptance, and create a life of freedom and meaning, then this podcast is for you. Thank you for being here.
So today I have a guest on the show, and I am talking to Livia Sara, aka Liv Label Free, who is an autism eating disorder recovery coach, best-selling author, content creator, and more. She helps neurodivergent individuals and their loved ones to find freedom. Liv Label Free is the idea that no one needs a label to live a life in which they feel fulfilled. Everyone has their own specific needs, and no label can ever house the complexity of what it makes to make each person unique. Livia's mission is to break the stigmas around mental health and empower people to fully recover from disordered eating whilst embracing their autistic traits. In the episode today, Livia talks about her own complex journey through anorexia nervosa recovery, later autism diagnosis, and finding her own freedom and healing. Livia describes how more traditional eating disorder treatment approaches were not helpful for her, and in hindsight, she understands this now as her autism was not recognised and many autistic traits were labelled as ED behaviours. Livia talks about helpful approaches she adopts in supporting her own clients today, and she brings a very compassionate and individualised approach to her work, respecting each person's unique experience and addressing issues with deep curiosity and compassion. If you wish to understand more about anorexia, the link with neurodivergence, and treatment approaches that can be helpful, this is definitely the episode for you. I hope that you enjoy the conversation. Before I delve into this week's episode, I just want to let you know that I've started writing on Substack. If you would like to read about eating disorders and disordered eating, if you want tips and skills from the therapy room, if you want to improve your relationship with food, I'm going to be writing twice a week on Substack. You can subscribe there and get my regular articles. And for every article I am writing, I'm also doing an audio to accompany it. So it's almost like a little extra free podcast. If you are interested to subscribe, do go to the link in the show notes and you can sign up, and hope to see some of you over there. Hi, Livia. Welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Harriet.
Oh, well, I'm so excited to have you here. It's been a long time coming, hasn't it, this episode, as we were saying off air. And do you want to just share a little bit with the listeners about your geographical movements and the things that have been going on for you recently? Because it sounds quite hectic.
Yeah, I don't even know where to start. Just for reference point context, I'm Dutch. I was born in the Netherlands. My parents are both Dutch. So I actually am bilingual in both English and Dutch. When I was a baby, we moved to Boston, USA, lived there until I was 15. When I was 15, we moved back to the Netherlands, lived there until I was 20. When I was almost 21, I moved to San Francisco. Then I moved back to Boston. Then I moved back to the Netherlands. And this past year, I was living in Boston again, but then there was mold in my apartment walls. So I put all my stuff in a storage unit in Boston, came back to the Netherlands. Didn't want to deal with the cold winter. I know you in the UK know about the winters. I am very sensitive to weather, and as soon as there's a cloud, I'm doom and gloom mood. So I was like, I'm going to escape to sunny. I went to Spain. I was in Madrid for a few weeks. I was about to go to Valencia, but then my entire Airbnb flooded. So I had to change my plans again. And now I'm in a small town in the south of France.
My goodness, what an adventure. Where do you hope to be? Are you hoping to move back to the States again for your base, or what's the next plan once you move next?
I'm hoping to move back to the States. I think that's also in for a large part why I decided to put all my stuff in a storage unit rather than sell it all on Facebook Marketplace. But just getting back there is such a journey. How am I going to find a place, something that's affordable, especially with the political situation? I'm kind of waiting how that's going to unpack. But I think something that I've been working on a lot is just learning to appreciate the moment as it is right now rather than constantly thinking next, 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 because that's kind of how life just passes us by. And I know it sounds so cliche. I'm so happy right now here in France. I mean, it's 20 degrees Celsius every day in November. It's sunny. I'm learning French, which I've always been wanting to learn. It's an adventure, but I'm trying to be present and embrace it.
Yeah, well, good for you. And I guess if you wanted to learn some lessons in surrender, you've definitely been given them this year, haven't you?
Yeah, actually, a few weeks ago, I injured my foot like really badly because I'm always in fight or flight mode and have anxiety. And I woke up and I was like, I need to do a full like dance shakeout. So I was doing these like really intense jumping shake dance moves. And I twisted my entire foot sideways and couldn't walk for weeks. And I was like, so that was also a huge surrender moment because I had to really be confronted with you can't be drowning yourself in distraction the whole time. Like you need to learn how to be with your own thoughts. And I think that experience for me was actually really enlightening in a lot of ways because it also showed me, just with my eating disorder history, how the eating disorder actually just was an escape from having to sit and be with my thoughts and my emotions. So, yeah, I'm sure we can get into all of that later, but surrender, I think, is the number one key word when it comes to eating disorder recovery because you can't recover by trying to control an outcome that you can't control.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Livia, can I firstly as well get you to introduce yourself to the listeners? Because I'm sure some people will know you, but a lot of people probably don't. So can you just say a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, so my name is Livia Sara, and I have the business Liv Label Free, and I have my own podcast, the Liv Label Free podcast. I'm an author, writer, blogger, eating disorder recovery coach with my own lived experience, and I specialize in neurodivergence and eating disorders. So I specifically work with autistic, ADHD, and other neurodivergent clients because through my own autism, ADHD discovery journey, I really understand the roots of my own eating disorder so much better in a way that I never could before, and in a way that a lot of my treatment providers and professionals just couldn't understand. And eating disorders do manifest very differently, and they look very differently for neurodivergent people, which is obviously going to impact recovery. And I think for me personally, for so many years, I was trying to fit this neurotypical mold of what I believed recovery looked like, but I just kept quote unquote failing. And it really almost ingrained that belief in me of this is going to be something I'm just going to have to deal with for the rest of my life. But I think when we come at eating disorder recovery with that trauma informed, with that neurodiversity affirming lens, we can really help the individual embrace their neurodivergence and separate that from the eating disorder. So that's what I do. Yeah, I have my podcast, my YouTube, my Instagram, my website, like I said. And I think my number one passion, aside from coaching, is writing. So I have 3 books now. I have my memoir, Rainbow Girl, my book, How to Beat Extreme Hunger, which is about overcoming extreme hunger, obviously. And then I have a cookbook, Nourishing Neurodiversity. Yeah, and I think in a nutshell, briefly, how brief can we get? That's who I am.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I just think amazing. It's incredible that you've written that many books. And how old are you, Livia?
Thank you. I turned 25 last week on November 19th.
Oh, well, happy birthday for last week. Yeah,
Thank you.
amazing, amazing. I mean, you're doing some fabulous work. I was just looking at your website earlier. I was just thinking, this is just so comprehensive and detailed and well thought out. So, yeah, it's a great resource, isn't it? I think for anyone who's wanting to dive into eating disorders and
That's so
neurodivergence.
sweet. Well, you just made my insides happy, so thank you.
Oh, so Olivia, can we talk through your story a little bit, actually? Because I think as well, your own personal story has really informed, hasn't it, how you work now with your own clients and your own lived
Yeah.
experience. And then with the more recent autism diagnosis as well, I guess, you probably, like you were saying in a way, so many things in your story now make a lot more sense. You've got that kind of greater insight,
Yeah.
haven't you? So I know you were born in the Netherlands, but you moved to Boston when you were a little baby.
Yeah, I was born in 1999 and we moved to Boston in 2000, so pretty shortly thereafter.
Sure. So what was your relationship with food like as a little girl? You want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the traditional eating disorder development stories I feel are about growing up in a household where the parents were always dieting or this kind of stuff. But my family was the complete opposite. We had everything in the house: cookies, cereal, white bread, chips. It was a little kid's quote unquote junk food paradise. And we were never constrained to, oh, you can only have that much. And I think because of that, we as kids had a very healthy relationship with food because food was abundant. So we never felt deprived in any way. And as a kid, it is worth mentioning that I was a quote unquote picky eater. I never wanted to try anything new. Every day for breakfast, it was, I don't know if you have this in the UK, but it was like the Fruit Loops cereal or Cinnamon Toast Crunch, which they say is, oh, bad, start your day with sugar, blah, blah, blah. But I would eat that for breakfast, or I would eat pancakes in the weekend. Lunch was usually very American, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but it had to be like on the specific white bread and the specific peanut butter and the specific jam, and anything else, I would not touch it. So it was, I think, very evident from the start. I was very selective in how I wanted things, and this manifested beyond food. In school and in art class, like I would only draw symmetrical rainbows and castles and trace coloring pages and nothing else. And I remember having a bit of a quarrel with my art teacher because we had to make something creative and out of the box. And I was like, no freaking way. I'm drawing a rainbow. And I was very steadfast and quote unquote stubborn in my ways. But other than that, my relationship with food was otherwise fine. I think what kind of planted the seeds of what eventually turned into an eating disorder was health class when I was 11 years old. I think it's kind of mandatory part of the curriculum everywhere nowadays. But learning about, I think it's a plate now, but back then we had the food pyramid and we learned about BMI and exercising a certain amount each day because you needed to prevent heart disease and drinking this much water per day. And I think for me, first of all, my autistic brain, well, characteristic autistic trait is literal thinking. So I took all of these recommendations so literally. And I remember I had this, I'm not even joking, a black and white composition notebook. And I wrote all these rules and lists in there of, okay, this is good food, this is bad food, this is a good movement routine, this is bad, this counts, this doesn't count. And pair that with feeling existentially lost growing up in a neurotypical world as an undiagnosed autistic person that doesn't understand why you feel so deeply different, but you just can't pin down what exactly it is. I think in a lot of ways, this path of I'm going to do food and exercise perfectly, it became my purpose. And I was like, if I just do this whole eating stuff right, I don't have to fear that I'm going to do life wrong.
Yeah, no, thank you for talking us
Yeah.
through that. And can you say a bit more about when you say like being in a neurotypical world and kind of feeling different and this almost existential crisis, although you wouldn't have been able to describe it as
Mhm.
that really, would you, at that age? But
In hindsight, I would, yeah.
sure, yeah, no, sure. How would you describe that as well? Was it sort of feeling of just kind of like not relating, not fitting in, feeling that you were looking at things differently? How was it to experience that?
I think the best way to describe it, obviously, this is kind of abstract because it isn't tangible. Like, there is no, oh, that's what it is. It's like on this deep soul level, you kind of feel like you're an alien. You feel like you're a different species. On the outside, you can see that you're the same species, but like inside, you feel like you're a different species. That's how I would describe it. And I think what that leads to is masking. So, this idea of hiding your true inside to match what everyone else is presenting as this is what it means to be an appropriate, acceptable human. I think some tangible ways that I did know, like I'm different, I'm an alien, is that my interests and my way of thinking and perceiving and experiencing the world was just so clearly different. Kind of going back to your first question about food growing up, I have always struggled with the concept of hunger and fullness cues. Like when I was a kid, And other kids would say, "Oh my gosh, I'm starving. My stomach just rumbled." Stomach rumbled? Like, that just didn't resonate with me because my stomach doesn't do that unless I haven't eaten for 2 days, which obviously I didn't ever experience. So the hunger cues were very different, and in the way people described that was very, that's not something I've experienced. And on the flip side, fullness was also an abstract thing for me that I just couldn't quite comprehend. Like when people would eat a few cookies, well, cookies aren't really filling, but eat a sandwich and they would say, "I'm full." For me, like, I honestly still experience this today. It's like I don't really feel full in the way people describe fullness until I am so full that I feel like I'm going to explode. As a neurodivergent person who has a healthy relationship with food now, I don't really use terminology like hunger and fullness, but I use more terminology like desire, needs, logic. Like, have I eaten this much today? Do I need to eat more? Do I feel satisfied around food rather than do I feel full? Because that just doesn't mean anything to me. And then, along with the hunger and fullness piece, I was never ever interested in like typical girly things. So like playing with dolls, I thought it was the most stupid waste of time ever.
Mhm.
There was no purpose in it for me. And I think that's another really common autistic trait is everything we do needs to have some sort of outcome that is worth striving for. I would be the only girl playing outside with the boys because I wanted to like run around, and I was like, if we can play soccer or football and I can score a goal and we can win, this has a purpose for me. But just playing with the dolls in the dollhouse, this has no clear end point, which again is abstract. The autistic mind can't comprehend it. And I think that's why we avoid it, which of
Mm.
course is part of where the eating disorder comes in, is because it's clear and the boundaries are clear and everything is clear. And that's why I prefer to see eating disorders, especially in the context of neurodivergence, as eating adaptations, because I think we're just trying to adapt and feel safe and have something to rely on in this world where everything is confusing and unreliable. And then I think the last thing that I'd say about how I knew I was different is just also the way that I experienced and approached like schoolwork specifically. I noticed for a lot of my friends, quote unquote friends, more acquaintances, they just despised school. Like they were like, "Oh, this is a waste of time. I just want to go out and play and do the doll stuff." But I was always someone who was so fascinated by learning. And I genuinely wanted to learn how DNA was encoded and how the genetics worked and how things got passed down. And I think that really deep seated curiosity in me and just not really feeling like other people were that passionate about learning as I was at such a young age, again, made me feel just like an alien, which just led me to feel very isolated. And then again, the eating disorder is like a little friend that comes into your life of, well, if no one else understands you, I'll always be here for you.
Time for a short advertisement break. Are you a counsellor, dietitian, therapist, nutritionist, personal trainer, or other mental health professional? Are you seeing increasing numbers of your clients struggling with eating disorders and disordered eating? And are you keen to learn skills and strategies and build confidence in working with your clients who struggle with these issues? We know that increasing numbers of people are struggling with eating disorders, and we know that 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight, and this means that many eating disorder symptoms are hidden. The Good Childhood Report in 2021 highlights appearance as a leading cause of unhappiness among young people and indicates that appearance concerns are increasing year upon year. So join my Eating Disorders Training Day on Zoom, face-to-face, or self-paced online. It will give you a really good understanding about the different types of eating disorders, including anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and OSFED, with an introduction to RFED and neurodiversity and eating disorders. You'll explore typical causes of eating disorders and understand how to create a psychological formulation for your client. And this will be brought to you by relating to client examples. I will take you through them, my specific knowledge, skills, and techniques, which can be used when supporting clients with eating disorders. You will get a full comprehensive training manual and access to the recording of the training afterwards and a full online version of the course. If you want to sign up, please go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk, and you might also be interested in my body image training for professionals too.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. I guess the eating disorder gave you a real kind of striving, didn't it? And sense of purpose where there was a kind of an outcome and it's very safe and you could control it. And was it less as well for you about
Yeah.
weight and shape? Like I know you're talking about health and being quite concerned about what you were eating, but was the weight shape part important for you as well? Or was it more a coping in terms of the other things you've just talked about?
I think when it comes to the weight shape, it's a lot more nuanced. Again, for me, I don't see it as it was weight shape related or it wasn't. For me, I think when it came to the weight slash shape, it was more of an internal experience than an appearance based experience. I didn't want to lose weight or change my shape or whatever because I wanted to look in the mirror and see someone thin or be accepted or anything like that, because I was like, I know I'm not going to be accepted no matter what I do. For me, it was more rooted in a sensory component. And I think that can be one of the most challenging aspects of the weight gain process for autistic individuals in recovery is that when I gained weight, I literally felt like I wanted to crawl out of my skin. I felt like I was being propped into like a mold that was not the right size. And it just felt, honestly, the way to describe it just felt excruciating to me to feel clothes being tighter and having fat in places that I had never had that before. And puberty for me, like because of my eating disorder, I didn't really start puberty until I was 18, 19 years old. That was like hands down one of the most difficult experiences of my entire life. Because again, you can't control it, it's unpredictable. Basically, every single autistic trait, it contradicts that. So for me, the weight shape piece was, again, less about needing to look a certain way, but more about feeling a certain way and wanting to feel comfortable and safe in a body that already never really felt like home. So when you add the unpredictability and the changes to that, it's like, well, this body is definitely not my home, which again makes the escape into the eating disorder so enticing because it just numbs you from that. You retreat into yourself, basically. It's like, you know how in like biology, when a plant cell like doesn't have enough water, how it like retracts inwards? That's kind of how I can visualize the eating disorder. Is it like makes you being retreat inwards into your body so that you aren't stretched to your limits. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's kind of how I'm imagining it.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating actually. It's just so helpful for you to really tease it apart and explain it.
Mhm.
Because
I'm so
it
glad.
does. I think as well, I'm sure some people listening that are neurotypical might relate to some of those things you were just talking about then as well. But I think it is quite different as well, isn't it? That more internal experience. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think just hearing you talk it through really has helped me get a bit more clarity.
I'm so glad.
Tell us a little bit about treatment and everything, because I know you didn't have the best experience with treatment, eating disorder treatment, did you?
Uh,
To start with, at least.
yeah. The first word that's coming up is just trauma. Trauma, trauma, trauma. But obviously that isn't very helpful. So yeah, where do you want me to start with that?
Yeah, well, I guess let's not kind of go into the deep dark side too much. So we want to really hear about what really helped you and dive more into your tips and strategies and all of the rest of it. But
Right.
I guess just when you look back and reflect on your treatment experience, what were the things that were really overlooked, do you think, in terms of taking on board the fact that you were neurodivergent? I know perhaps you weren't diagnosed at the time, were you? So people were kind of,
No,
yeah, but I
yeah.
guess you were kind of
Yeah.
forced through a certain model, weren't you, that was not massively helpful?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I definitely have some direction now. And I think because just for clarification purposes, I was diagnosed with anorexia and depression when I was 11. And I would say I was recovered as far as I believe one could be recovered, kind of with the whole I'm recovered, but I'm always going to have to be on the lookout for signs of relapse kind of recovered. When I was 19, I'd say. And then when I was 20 and I started recovery coaching, that's when I discovered I'm autistic. For me, the entire duration of treatment for my eating disorder, there was never any, oh, she might be autistic. Just all the traits, all the nuances, all the differences. the idea, the concept of separating autistic traits from eating disorder behaviors was never, ever a thing. But I think my first experience with treatment that is so incredibly harmful, again, I don't want to generalize here, but for most autistic people, FBT, family-based therapy, I think that's kind of termed the gold standard treatment approach, especially for younger people with anorexia specifically, although I know it's being used for bulimia and other eating disorders as well. But FBT, I don't know how familiar your listeners are with it, but it stands for family-based therapy. It's also known as the Maudsley method because it originated at the Maudsley Hospital in London, I think in the 1980s, and it was proposed as like an alternative treatment for people with anorexia that didn't isolate the patient from their family, and it encouraged parents and caregivers to take an active role, basically to take full control over the person's eating. And then as the person would supposedly gain weight and make more peace with eating more and resting, they would gradually gain back autonomy over their food choices, and then magically health would be restored. And I mean, in theory, it sounds wonderful. I think for autistic people who have a heightened need for autonomy and for control, FBT can be so harmful because I remember, being discharged from residential treatment, like after I'd been hospitalized and stuff. And I was so excited to go home because I wanted to make my own food again. And I remember being sat down in the therapy office with my parents and being told, yeah, Livia, she's not allowed to make anything herself. Like, you as parents have to make everything for her. And I was like, this has to be some sort of nightmare. Like, this can't be real. I even remember my parents, and I later confirmed this with them, they knew it wasn't going to work because that was never how our family had functioned. Even as a young kid, like I said, we were free to grab whatever food we wanted. Like, it was never like a hierarchical situation. Again, I'm going to spare you all the details, but that was highly, highly traumatizing, not only for me, but for the entire family. Because I'm sure, as you can imagine, fighting, resistance, you telling me I have to eat that, well, now I'm not going to eat that because you asked me to. Demand avoidance plays huge role in this too. So FBT was really harmful. And then on a more like individual level, when I was in treatment and when I actually chose recovery when I was 17, there were so many autistic needs and traits that I now see were autistic needs and traits. But at the time, I kind of just saw them as like personality characteristics that were so-called eating disorder behaviors, but that were not actually related to my restriction or fear of weight gain at all. And like an example, it's like number attachment. I'm someone who's always counting everything in my head. I'm someone who seeks patterns, who's always making connections. Like when I'm folding laundry, all the shirts have to be in a pile of four. If there's like an uneven, then I'll make a new sequence, and then the socks have to be in a pile. And I do it with everything in life. I can't think of a lot of examples right now, but I attach pretty much numbers to everything. Like when I'm writing my books too, it's like I have to write 500 words today and I'm not stopping until I've hit this goal. That's just the way that I think I build in those boundaries for myself, because if there are no boundaries, then I feel that existential loss. And I'm like, well, then there's infinite options. And what if I choose the wrong one? And that spirals me into really severe anxieties. So that's something that I learned about myself is I need boundaries, constraints around everything. And numbers conveniently give us that in a lot of ways. I think for me, an example in eating disorder treatment was I had my food scale. Like my food scale was my lifeline, not just throughout my eating disorder, but like also in my recovery after treatment when I granted myself permission that I could use my food scale without it being tied to restriction or fear, but simply in needing to have tangible certainty over something. That was in eating disorder treatment, eating disorder behavior. And I remember asking, okay, well, why? Explain to me why. Because I think, again, as autistic people, we need to know why. You can't tell us something is the way it is until you give us rock solid evidence that that is true. And they would say, oh, because you want to restrict. And I would say, no, because I'm fine with eating more as long as I know the number. And then they'd say, yeah, well, that's your eating disorder talking. Is your eating disorder in the room with us? And just pathologizing me the whole time, as you can imagine, so invalidating, that it got to a point with more and more behaviors that I was just being honest because they told me you have to be honest in treatment. I would be honest, but then they'd say, you're lying, you're being manipulative, you're being treatment resistant. And I kind of learned in treatment, okay, well, being honest doesn't get me anywhere. So I just need to tell the therapists what I know they want to hear. That's kind of be my exit ticket. And I mean, that goes without saying, that kind of defeats the entire purpose of treatment if you're just saying stuff that's not true so that you can kind of get out. I think the invalidation piece is the biggest problem with when treatment isn't neurodiversity affirming. It's just this immediate judgment and assumption that it's quote unquote the eating disorder talking without any kind of curiosity as to, well, maybe this isn't the eating disorder talking, and exploring that with the client or patient. I've said this before in my podcast and in my books about the reason why I believe in living label free is because when we remove labels and judgments, that opens us up to curiosity. And the magic and the power of curiosity is that it allows us to discover alternative pathways. Because if I say this is the best way, this is the only way to do it, well, I've immediately shut myself off from doing it any other way. And then you get stuck because if this path that you have decided is the only best way doesn't work, oh, well, then I guess nothing works because there's nothing else, right? And that's, I think, again, with FBT and labeling these treatments as the gold standard, I just think that's so unhelpful because then if FBT doesn't work, it's like, oh, well, I guess there's nothing else. I guess I'm going to give up on you, which benefits no one.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. So I'm sure there'll be people listening that will find some of this really relatable, actually, and just so validating to hear you talking about these things openly. I mean, I guess thankfully things are shifting a bit, aren't they, in eating disorder treatment in the last few years? But I think there's still quite a long way to go, isn't there?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I don't know if you saw this paper, but Edna Eating Disorders Neurodiversity Australia published a lived experience narrative review a few days ago about neurodivergence and eating disorders, and it is absolutely fantastic. And they talk in that paper about how no treatment program can really ever claim to be neurodiversity affirming until we are actually allowing lived experience stories to dictate what neurodiversity affirming even means. Because we've seen this a lot in the autism space. It's like, we're autism advocates. And everyone who's saying that isn't autistic. You can't be an autism advocate if you don't even know what it's like to be autistic. You can be an ally, but you can't be an advocate. And I think when it comes to like neurodiversity affirming recovery, that has to be decided by the neurodivergent people what that even looks like, not based on observations and assumptions of what other people think neurodivergent people need. Because, yeah, I mean, I don't even have to elaborate on that.
Sure. So, Livia, can you just tell us a little bit then about when people kind of come to work with you and you're really working in this very, it sounds like kind of very kind of client-centered, curious way, really working with that neurodivergence. Can you give us a bit of an insight into that process? And I know that's a massive question, just a bit of a kind of taste of it, I guess.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I'm really an advocate for is depathologizing both autism and neurodivergence, but also depathologizing the eating disorder. I mean, I hinted at this earlier, but I don't believe in this terminology of eating disorder because when we do that, we're basically labeling this person as a problem that needs to be solved or fixed. And obviously, I'm not saying that eating disorders are wonderful things because obviously they present issues. However, at the same time, eating disorders also serve a very important function. They're an adaptive response to feel safety and security in an environment in circumstances that don't feel safe and secure. And I think when we can stop pathologizing the eating disorder and really invite curiosity to, well, how is it benefiting you in your life? Like, what function is it serving? Then we can explore what's actually going on and what needs you're trying to meet through the eating disorder. And when we know what needs you're trying to meet, then we can explore other ways to get those needs met in a way that actually aligns with who you want to be rather than living in this constant state of fear and limitation. So I think the deep pathologization is a cornerstone of my work. And then secondly, I mean, again, second, third, fourth, I could go on for hours about this. I think it's also about redefining what a recovered life means that's completely separate from everything you've been conditioned to believe recovery has to mean for you. So for me, for example, I was often told in treatment, when you are recovered from your eating disorder, you'll be able to be more spontaneous around food. You'll be able to say yes to last minute dinner invitations. Maybe for a neurotypical person, that is a huge goal. Like having someone ask you for drinks 5 minutes in advance and being able to say, yes, I'll go because I'm not afraid of the calories in an extra drink. Okay, maybe that's a goal for them. But for many autistic people, we do not like having things last minute. If you ask me anything last minute, food related or not, I'm probably going to say no. I'm going to say, I would love to next week because I have other plans today. Again, redefining what recovery means and making it really clear what are habits you want to be engaging with. What are maybe aspects of traditional recovery that we would have to adapt or kind of shapeshift to match and align with you as a unique human? And more importantly, align with the life you want to live. Because I think a lot of the time, people are presented with you need to recover because recovery is worth it. Kind of going back to that idea of that autistic people need to understand why and we need clarity. To say recovery is worth it is absolutely meaningless to our minds because we're like, what does that even mean? There's no clear outcome. And I think, again, if there's no clear outcome, we're not going to do anything. A lot of what I work on with my clients is really defining the future you who's aligned, the future you that's doing what you want to do, and kind of setting that as a destination. And then from there, we can kind of work out, well, what are the steps that we not need to take together? Because obviously, you don't need to recover from your eating disorder. It's about wanting to recover. Because humans don't do what we need to do. We do what we want to do in the end and we want to feel safe. So I ask them, what steps do you want to take to bring you closer to you? And obviously, there's a lot of nuance here because sometimes the steps that we know in our hearts are the ones to take are not easy and they're not always what we want to do. I mean, when I sit down to write my 1,000 words that are hard and I have to do my research for my books, there's not a bone in my body that wants to sit down and do the research. But there's a part of me that wants the outcome of doing the research. And I think, again, when we can kind of shift to that perspective in recovery of, okay, you may not want to gain weight, you may not want to deal with the discomfort, but you do want the freedom and the alignment of taking this hard step now, that can in and of itself be such a driver and motivator in recovery, not only for neurodivergent people, but for anyone. So I think constantly bringing that bigger picture into perspective is especially important for neurodivergent people because we can often be so detail oriented and get twisted up in our minds about the next best step. So by constantly bringing everything into perspective and zooming out, asking yourself, why are you doing this? It's like, okay, I can remember, focus, let's go, put those blinders on. I mean, again, there's so many overlaps with just recovery in general, but I think really crystallizing these concepts is especially important in neurodiversity affirming eating disorder recovery.
Yeah, no, sure. So it really sounds like when you're working with your clients as well, you're really aiming for that real clarity, aren't you? And having that destination almost. You can't just recover
Yeah.
because it's worth it. You really got to
Right.
have thought about the details a bit more. Sure. No, really interesting. And do you have any sort of specific things? I know you were talking about how challenging the whole body image piece was for you, and I guess for many of your clients as well. I guess there's no shortcut through that, is there? But do you have any kind of additional thoughts, I guess, managing some of that when you are autistic?
Yeah, well, I think there's, of course, the practical things of just get rid of anything that's tight or itchy or is just too uncomfortable on your skin. Like, I threw out my jeans years ago and I haven't touched jeans ever since. And I'm like, freedom. That was almost a huge, I think for me, really difficult to do from like a societal perspective because I was like, I need jeans because everyone has jeans and everyone wears jeans. But I was like, no, I don't. Like, if I don't want to wear jeans, I don't need to do that. All of my clothes are either super stretchy and they're comfortable and they're like jersey cotton material. Cut out tags, not because of the size or whatever, but because it's itchy and annoying. So I'd say get comfortable clothes. Also, when it comes to just picking foods, like pick foods that aren't gonna distend your stomach. And I know that can be really difficult because high volume vegetables for someone with anorexia seems so much safer than eating the dense cookies. But from a recovery perspective and just physical perspective, I felt so much more satisfied eating 10 cookies than I did eating a giant salad and then still wanting more food after that because it was basically just air. So those are like two practical things. But I think on a very metaphysical sense, something that has helped me massively, an insight that I actually only came to in the past few years, which has really actually helped me make peace with my body, like that's gone through puberty and stuff, was just this idea that I don't view my body as my possession. I think there's this like overarching message on social media of the importance of loving your body and loving what you're seeing in the mirror and self love. And I mean, if that resonates with you, that's wonderful. But quote unquote, my body has never felt like my home or whatever people say about the way your body is supposed to be your safe haven. I think for the general overarching neurodivergent experience is feeling like your insides and your outsides are not matched together. Because again, with the hunger cues, mentally when I want to do something, but physically being too exhausted to do it, wanting to sleep, my mind not wanting to sleep, I feel like my body is always in a battle with itself. For me, what has been really helpful with regard to the weight gain and stuff is again, almost seeing this vessel that hosts my being as part of like the ecosystem, which is the planet. And I often give this example that helps people understand this better of like, if I bought seeds at the garden store and planted an apple tree in my backyard and it became this beautiful tree and the apples fell and I was like, yay, beautiful apple tree. I could say if it's in quote unquote my backyard, that's my apple tree, but it isn't really mine at all. It's the planet's because what happens when I'm not here anymore, the tree is going to decompose, the apples are going to fall, they're going to go back into the earth. It's going to create new matter, there's going to be new trees, new flowers, whatever. And that's kind of how I see quote unquote again my body is like my body is only on this planet right now so that my existence, my true essence, my true being that can never have a tangible form. My body is only here right now so that this existence is possible. And it is critical for me that I nourish and keep this vessel healthy because if I don't do that, then my existence cannot reach its maximum potential. So that again, from a very medical, physical perspective, has really helped me make peace and really accept and respect even the parts of my body that I don't like. Because, like, yeah, well, if I try to control this, if I try and change this, I'm not gonna be able to focus on my writing. I'm not gonna be able to be present in client calls. I'm not gonna be able to have these podcast episodes because I'm gonna be thinking about food. So kind of all those things. I hope that kind of made sense because I know it's kind of a very nuanced, abstract concept, but it's really helped me and so many of my clients, honestly.
Sure. No, I think that's such a helpful perspective, actually. And I think that's a perspective that we can all take on board to some extent. So thank you for sharing that. I think really, really valuable insight. So, Livia, I know we could just talk forever, so much that you could potentially share. But I just wonder, like, where can people find you? And I know you did mention a few things at the beginning, but if you can just kind of say all the best places if people want to get in touch with you, find out about your courses, etc.
I think all things Liv Label Free you can find on my website, livlabelfree.com. I'm on Instagram, Liv Label Free. I have a YouTube channel. My podcast is the Liv Label Free podcast. And if you want to read my books, you can also find them via my website. There's literally a books tab. And I mean, if you just search Livia Sara Liv Label Free on Google, there's no one else with that name. I think it shouldn't be too hard to find me in this digital age we live in nowadays.
Sure, no, amazing. Thank you so much, Olivia. Really appreciated having you on the podcast today. And thank you for sharing just so vulnerably. And it's just wonderful just for you to really talk through your experience and how you support your clients with that kind of detail and clarity. Because I feel I've learned an awful lot today as well. And I'm sure the listeners definitely have. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Harriet, for having me. I'm so grateful to have provided some of my insights.
So I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. Do go and check out all of Livia's info in the show notes. If you're not following me already on Instagram, do seek me out, the Eating Disorder Therapist _. If you enjoy articles, information, written stuff about eating disorders, you might want to read my Substack. The link is in the show notes. If you enjoy this podcast, I'll be so grateful if you follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.